You've seen it on TV. The forensic investigators meticulously combing through a crime scene, dusting for fingerprints, analyzing bloodstains and body remains, to piece together the clues. But how accurate is this portrayal of crime scene investigation in the real world? From CSI, Bones, to Law & Order, popular media has long romanticized forensic science. But what do real forensic scientists have to say about these portrayals? Do they really do the things they do? Today we're talking with an expert in forensic science.
So my name is Professor Kelly Miles, and my area of research expertise is in forensics, specifically human decomposition, and the study of human decomposition is what we call taphonomy.
Now, throughout the episode, Kelly will be debunking common misconceptions and answering some of the most pressing questions about forensic science. Can you really tell how long a body has been dead just by looking at it? What happens to a body when it's buried versus when it's left in the open? Join us as we take a closer look at the world of crime scene investigation and discover the real science behind the scenes. This is Science Debunked. So, first things first, what is forensics?
Forensics is sort of a big umbrella term, so you can have food forensics, wildlife forensics, and then medical legal forensics, right? The stuff that we think of as it relates to humans and legal casework. So forensic science basically wants to take parts of science and how it can be presented in a court of law as scientific evidence that can either prove or disprove something, or you can bring it in as evidence to indicate that perhaps this person did it or this person didn't do it. So to include or exclude certain people from crimes.
Now, Kelly studies a specific area of forensics called forensic taphonomy.
We all know that after you die, if left out, nature will do its thing, you will decompose. And that, to some extent, happens in a very predictable pattern over time. So we can get a very rough estimation of how long a person has been dead based on the condition of their body tissues when they're recovered. So if I was to die out in the woods and you find me 2 days later, my tissues are going to look very different than if you find me 2 months later. So it's an expanding area of research in forensic taphonomy to try to get a good, reliable estimate of the PMI, the post-mortem interval.
PMI, or the post-mortem interval, is a crucial factor in forensic investigations, as it helps investigators determine the timeline of events leading up to a person's death. By analyzing the physical and chemical changes that occur within the body after the death, forensic scientists can estimate the PMI and narrow down the window of time in which the person died. Determining PMI can be a complex process that involves examining a range of factors, such as temperature, humidity, the presence of insects or scavengers. These factors can provide clues about how long the body has been exposed to the elements and help investigators estimate PMI with greater accuracy. Now let's delve into a case that highlights the importance of taphonomy in forensic investigations. The case of Robert Pickton. Robert Pickton was a well-known figure in the community, recognized for his friendly demeanor and local involvement. However, beneath the surface, Pickton harbored a dark secret that would ultimately lead to his undoing. Born in British Columbia, Canada in 1949, Pickton grew up on his family's pig farm, where he and his brother Dave started a pig breeding business after their father's death in 1976. But in 1995, Pickton's peaceful facade began to unravel as he began luring women into his farm and killing them. Pickton's method of killing was brutal and savage, often with a .22 caliber rifle and the dismemberment of his victims' bodies, which he then buried in pig manure. While many myths surround Pickton's crimes, one commonly believed falsehood is that he used manure to speed up the decomposition of his victims' bodies.
There's often been this sort of wives' tale, or this myth out there, that if you want to get rid of a body and want it to decompose really fast, you put pig manure on it, right? You have the body, dig up a bunch of pig manure, coat it, and then that will somehow expedite decomposition. So the tissue, you get rid of the tissues faster. So that was the idea why I did it, because it seemed interesting and it was a question that nobody had answered out there.
To dispel this old wives' tale, Kelly went out into the field and took a group of recently deceased piglets and subjected them to 4 different treatments. One group was left exposed to the elements with no burial, while the others were buried under normal soil, pig manure, and horse manure. The reason why she did 2 types of manure is because the diets of pigs and horses are fairly different, and she wanted to see if the 2 different treatments would garner different results. All pigs were caged to prevent the effect of scavengers, and these treatments were then measured for their level of decomposition at different times. Now, there may be one question that's floating around in your minds. Why use pigs?
So, of course, pigs and humans aren't exactly the same, but anatomically we share a lot of similarities. So, for example, we have sort of similar hair coverage, right? You can see the pink through, but we're not completely hairy like a dog or a cat would be. For example, the mitral valve in pig hearts can be transplanted into humans. We've been doing that for quite some time. Pig skin can be used on human skin grafts, so people that have wounds or burns, that type of thing, we can use pig skin for that, and it works very well. So in areas where you don't have the advantage of having a nearby Taphonomy research center, where we use pigs as human analogs because pigs are very like humans in some ways, so we can use pigs as proxies or as analogs to get some basic information, and then those can be validated with actual human bodies in those restricted areas.
Now, before we discuss the results, there is an important concept in forensic taphonomy called Caspers Law.
When you're talking about decomposition of tissues, and I'm talking about like the soft tissues, not the bones, because the bones are going to be left for millennia if you leave them there long enough. I'm talking about the soft tissues. So Caspers Law is basically sort of this general rule where if a body's in an environment with less oxygen, decomposition is to some extent very reliant on the availability of oxygen for those tissue breakdowns. So if a body is left on the surface of the soil, it will decompose more quickly than a body that's in water, right? Roughly twice as fast, as opposed to a body that's completely buried in soil. That body on the top of the soil will decompose roughly 8 times as fast. So it's a 1 to 2 to 8 surface deposition submerged in water, buried in soil. And it's mostly to do with the availability of oxygen for those decomposition processes.
Now that we've gotten that out of the way, does pig manure really accelerate decomposition?
So, and what I had found in my paper that I wrote was essentially it was less important what it was buried in, it being the piglet, it was more important whether it was buried or not. So we didn't find a whole lot of difference between the soil burial, the pig manure burial, or the horse manure burial. Everything that was buried, it was either buried or it wasn't. That was the main factor. So at the end of it, the main conclusion was it didn't expedite it, and in fact, because it was covered and there was less oxygen getting in, the piglets in pig manure actually had a slower decomposition than the pigs that were just left out exposed to the elements. So it was exactly the opposite of what that sort of myth had been.
Interesting.
So busted.
Yeah, very much busted, yes.
Very much busted.
Right, so there you have it. Manure burials actually slow the rate of decomposition rather than accelerating it. But what does this mean for future cases like Picton?
So this was basically a pilot study to get a rough comparison of surface deposition, whether it be pigs or whatever, versus buried in soil versus different kinds of manure. To have any sort of real legal implications, you would have to scale that up. So you would then I used piglets, stillborn piglets. In taphonomy, the standard is to use adult pigs of a minimum of sort of in the 50 to 60 pound range. Does that correlate with what the piglets, because piglets are this big, adult pigs are this big, and size differences can affect decomposition. And then if you were fortunate enough to have research money, and time and money is no object, at one of the human body facilities, then repeat it on human bodies and see what it does. So it's always, research by its core is always this was my question, I got an answer to that question, and that question leads to a bunch of more questions. And that's literally how science works. So it's a good sort of a proof of concept. I would definitely want to scale it up with larger pigs and then use it with humans. But it's a very good preliminary indication that if you want to get rid of a body, to hide it is one thing, but to get rid of the soft tissues, burying it in pig manure is not the best way to go, because the preliminary evidence says that no, you're actually preserving the tissues as opposed to decomposing them faster.
you.